Thank you all for coming out today. Before I move on to the panel, I'd just like to inform everyone that there's a response form being circulated around. And if you could please fill that out and leave it at the table behind, we'd greatly appreciate it. Now moving on to the panel, it's our third panel, it's our final panel. It's on international law and the cost of drone warfare. And the chair for this panel is Mark Evans, and he's a professor of sociology at Henry Ford Community College. So if you could please come up. Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to thank everybody for attending for what is a very important topic. And I'd like to introduce the guests that will be speaking this afternoon. First, I'd like to introduce Madiha Tahir. She is an independent multimedia and print journalist. Her work has appeared in Foreign Affairs, The National, The Wall Street Journal, and on PRI, BBC's The World, and one of my favorite shows, Democracy Now! And the second guest that we have is James Cavallaro. Did I pronounce that correctly? All right. He is the director of the Stanford International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic, and he is the co-author of Living Under Drones. So it's my understanding that we'll be watching a short video then. Okay.
Okay, good afternoon. And the video is queued up. So let me start with that, and then I'll speak all at once rather than speaking a bit video and then speaking again. So here we go. Hopefully the technology will work with us. Do we have volume? I think we need, can we turn on the volume? Is there volume? I don't. Yes, no? So why don't we do this? Yeah, so it's back there with the speakers there. So here's what I propose. It'll take me a second. Okay. We are experiencing technical difficulties. So since we're experiencing technical difficulties, I'll go straight to the talk that I was going to give for 20 minutes. The video is still showing, but it's on the back of the screen. So if and when you get the audio, there will be a blur out of the audio, at which point we will go video and audio together. And if it doesn't come up, then I will just direct you all to the link livingunderdrones.org where you can watch the 7-minute video. Okay, that said, let's hold on, let me start at the beginning. Let's start with this presentation, and let me just Murphy's Law. Of course, all I had to do was start. Okay, so this is the video. Voila, I will sit down.
Most of the media coverage and U.S. government line in the United States is that drone strikes are very precise and they target with surgical precision particular militants and terrorists.
What we have documented is that drones kill not only terrorists, they kill many others, they kill civilians, they have killed women and children.
We went to Pakistan in 2 separate investigation missions to speak with people who themselves had experienced drone strikes.
The result of our research is a report entitled Living Under Drones. We were particularly concerned about drones because our own government is involved in using drones, and we believe there has not been adequate oversight of the use of drones and the basis for deciding who gets killed, where, and when. We gained access to the people in what's called the Fatah region, the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan. That's an area that is cordoned off and into which virtually no one can enter. We were able to speak to people from that area who came out to other parts of Pakistan and to interview with us. One of the things we found is that there are entire communities who live in areas where drones are flying overhead 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at times. And these people don't know when those drones will strike. They don't know who they will strike. The result is symptoms of psychological disorder, of trauma, of severe anxiety, and of dysfunctionality. We heard stories of people who won't leave their houses.
The drones stream of the Mumbai Rakabandi, the Kardil, Jatasari was the only. Aksar Khalid Mudu, as yet, Zini, pressure, natural, the Peshawar, the Taranta, the drone.
When we interviewed psychiatrists and psychologists who had treated people with these symptoms, they said that a number of people displayed very serious symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD.
We may not have declared war on Pakistan, but for the people living in northwest Pakistan under drones, they're in a war zone. One of the things we found and documented were incidents of double tapping.
There'll be an initial strike on a target, and then very shortly after, a secondary strike. What has happened in the period between the first and the second strike is that neighbors or people nearby or family members, or in some cases doctors, have come to assist those who may have been injured and still survived.
And when they're doing that, a second drone has hit. The people with whom we spoke in the communities affected, almost without exception, told us, when there's a drone strike, we won't go near afterwards. And we even heard this from some medical professionals.
It has made people extremely angry at the United States.
The New York Times recently classified drones in a piece as the new Guantanamo, the new recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda. One of the things we heard from several people is that they didn't know what America was before drones. And now what they know of America is drones, death, and terror.
One person we interviewed asked me, do American people know what these drone strikes are doing? Do American people know the strikes are killing civilians here? And people said to us, we want you to go back, now that you've spoken to us, and tell the American public the impact that drone policies are having.
Through our report, we would like the American people to understand that the narrative that they have heard about drones is not accurate. That drones cause death to civilians, they terrorize entire populations, and they may well be counterproductive at many levels.
We need to rethink our policies in light of the disastrous impact the drone strikes are having on the people who live under them.
Okay. Okay, so we can probably go back to lights. And I hope the, well, I won't kill the sound because we may need it later. Okay, so what I thought I'd do in the next 15 or 18 minutes or so before we move to the next presentation is give you a little bit of context and background, and then to address some of the debates that are occurring around drones now in the States, but also, since this is a conference on Pakistan and human rights, address a bit some of the effects of drones and drone policy in Pakistan. And there I'm particularly interested in the comments of the experts on Pakistan, of which I am not one. My work on drones has been specific. It's taken me to Pakistan. I've spent a fair amount of time trying to understand the broader context, speaking with literally scores of experts, reading background, et cetera, but I'm not a South Asian expert. I'm a human rights professor and a human rights lawyer. And our entree into this issue was as a human rights clinic, a human rights center based in the United States, concerned about the effects of United States policies. When we started to address the issue of drones, and here I'll jump to the slide, it was late 2011. And at that period, in the States, the main discourse about drones, to the extent that people paid attention, and they were not paying very much attention then, but the dominant discourse was a discourse which emphasized the precise surgical nature of weaponized drones. There's some pushback there. There are potential technical difficulties. There have been snafus. There have been errors. But I'm going to cabin that, and we can accept for the sake of argument that drones can fire missiles with accuracy. That's only half the question. The issue is, where are they firing them? What's the target? What is that based on? Invariably, it's based on intelligence. How good is that intelligence? And then a whole set of other questions relate to what is the legality of a particular strike? How is that determined? And then other broader questions about what are the geopolitical consequences? What are the ethical consequences? What is the impact for the local democracy? What is the impact for our democracy here in the United States? So the precise nature of the drone is one question among many, but there has been a good deal of misinformation, in part because the first framing of drones discourse in the United States has been done largely by authorities, and has tended to focus on the weapon in sort of an Xbox mentality of, oh, look how cool this new weapon is, without looking at all of the very serious consequences that surround the use of a weapon that may or may not be able to pinpoint a particular target on planet Earth. Okay? So the debate that we entered into at the end of 2011 was one in which, here's some quotes. No collateral damage. No one is being injured. And by the way, again, this is sort of tough to believe for people who are familiar with Pakistan and who may read Pakistani papers and may have family in Pakistan and may have other data points. Most people in the United States are not in that selected group. Many of you in this room are. But for those who, watch Fox News and CNN, maybe MSNBC, maybe NPR, the database has been extremely limited on drones. It's getting better, but at the end of 2011, when we started this research, this was the dominant narrative, and this is what most people believed, despite the fact that we were receiving information as a human rights organization that forced us to question whether this was accurate. So we decided as an organization to research and document what was happening with drones. Now, part of this, and just a footnote on the way human rights works in the world, because we were at a university in the United States with a certain degree of prestige, our investigation documentation, according to a fairly rigorous methodology, is likely, and has had some impact because of all of those markers of acceptability in Western media framing the discourse. A lot of what we found and documented is not news to people who understand Pakistan. But it was news to people in the United States, and that is important in terms of the political nature of debates about drones. So what did we find? Let me get this bag out of my own way since I walk too much. And here are some of our major findings. Okay. I'll take choice B because otherwise I feel like Oprah Winfrey walking around. Or more like, I'll date myself, more like Monty Hall in Let's Make a Deal. Anyone watch TV Land or is like me, well, over 20 years old?
Clip it on and then turn it on.
Is it on?
Could be. It has.
If it's on. Okay. Yeah, it's on. Okay. I'm going to put this in my pocket so I don't feel so ridiculous. Okay. So let me just run through the major findings, and I'll talk about some of the political, ethical, and legal consequences in some of the debates that we see today in the States about drones, and also some of the debates in Pakistan. Okay. There are several what are called data aggregators. There are three main data aggregators in the West. We went through those. We checked their sourcing. We checked the information they have, whether they compile strikes on a one-by-one basis, individual strikes, or they accumulate, whether they update their information, et cetera. The source that I would say is most reliable, and if you want to know what's happening with drones, is the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, TBIJ. Their data show somewhere between 2,600 and 3,500 killed in Pakistan, civilians between high 400s and close to 900, 176 children. The film, the short video, gives you some of this, so I'll be quick here. But one of the things that we found that surprised us most has to do with the constant effect, or the effect of the constant presence of drones in particular communities. We expected to enter into the fray about how many civilians were killed, how many quote-unquote militants were killed. Let me cabin that because I want to get back to that idea of militants killed. And to be able to examine particular cases and make determinations. We did that. Our report goes through. We assess the different data aggregators, and we also look at individual strikes and say, in this strike, this is the most credible information. We talk with a number of witnesses. We cross-reference that with media information, with governmental information, et cetera, et cetera. Here's what we think happened. We did that. And all that is in the report, and all that shows that there are significant civilian casualties. Okay. What we found as well, which surprised us, were the consequences to entire communities of living in areas where numbers of drones hover overhead 24 hours a day, making a small buzzing noise, flying overhead. And if you think about it, what does it mean to live in an area in which at any point a Hellfire missile might fire down, might come down, and kill who's ever in the region? Knowing also that these Hellfire missiles have a kill radius of 15 to 20 meters, and knowing also that certain types of activity are believed to be suspicious by those operating drones. So gathering in groups with other men might be deemed suspicious. There have been instances where people have been killed going to mosque. There's a group of men going to mosque in the morning. Being in groups coming to the aid of someone who's been hit by a drone strike is a dangerous activity. And as a result of that, people have changed their patterns of life to conform to what they feel the dangers are. So what does that mean? It means you probably don't go out and play soccer with your guy buddies, but you also might not want to walk by a field where people are playing soccer, or where there's a group of men who are congregating. Or you might not want to let your kid go to school because your kid might stop on the corner and watch a group of guys playing cards, and they might be too close if there's a strike then, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a context in which there's significant fear. That's added to the fact that it is widely believed, and there's significant information to support this, although I can't state this with categorical certainty, that one of the ways in which people are identified is by chips that have a homing device that indicate the coordinates for drone operators to fire Hellfire missiles. So they're believed to be small chips, and there may very well be. And the way they work is, if I think, say, Madiha is a person that is an appropriate target for those who are paying me, I might leave a chip in her house, in her car, or somewhere that I can then say, oh, I've left the chip, and now you can fire the missile. So it's bred enormous distrust between and among people, and there are incidents of people who have been executed by Taliban and others, allegedly for placing chips or attempting to place chips. So you have a general breakdown in these communities. That was something we heard from pretty much everyone we spoke with, and it was something that we didn't go to investigate. And it's something that should be part of the debate and the understanding about drones, because the debate has focused on, are we killing civilians or are we killing militants? And as long as we, the United States, is killing militants, then there are no problems, okay? I want to push back on that in a second, but first let me make the point that even when drones aren't killing, they are disrupting society in very, very significant ways. Then let me make a point about civilians and militants. Again, unfortunately, part of the problem with the narrative and the debates on drones is much of this has been framed in a context of secrecy, where information is not released, where there's almost no transparency, and who is ahead of the curve on establishing what the terms are anonymous intelligence officials. And so the anonymous intelligence officials pretty much invariably report immediately 14 militants were killed. And dutifully, most Western media play the part of stenographer as opposed to investigative journalist. Any of you who are studying journalism, please be journalists and not stenographers. Sorry for that little plug, but I gotta get that in. And report so many militants killed. Implicit in that, it's a very interesting move, but implicit in that is the idea that if the person killed was a militant, then his death was legitimate. Let me just give you an example. Suppose you have a group of people, in a given country, let's say it's Waziristan, who are training to enter into Syria to topple the Assad regime, okay? Now, because we don't like the Assad regime, those people would be freedom fighters. They'd be militants. They'd look just like militants. They'd have weapons. They'd be doing things in groups that look military-like. And if they were killed, if the only classification is militant and non-militant, then that's okay. We killed militants. That's all right. The point is, that's not the relevant question at almost any level. Legally, the question is, are these individuals who lawfully may be targeted under international humanitarian law, which are the laws of war? I can go into depth on that in Q&A. I know we're running out of time, so I'll just say that the answer to that question is not nearly as easy as are they militants or not militants. Make a few more points, and then we'll go to questions. You can read this as I move on. I'll leave it on the screen for a second. This is an interesting quotation from someone who happened to be in New York at the time of 9/11 and then spent a lot of time working in North Waziristan, but it's something that sort of brings home the sense of general pervasive fear. Legal analysis. Let me just raise a couple of questions, and then we'll move to the next slide, and then I'll wrap up in, I think 3:35 will be an even half an hour, right? We start at 5 after, ballpark? So I want to make sure Madiha has enough time. Some of the legal questions considered. You may have seen recently a white paper which discusses some of the issues related to under what circumstances may the United States kill or order a drone attack to kill a high-value terrorist suspect, and in particular when that high-value terrorist suspect is a national of the United States. This is the case of al-Awlaki, who was killed by a U.S. drone. And there's been a good deal of analysis about that context. here are the important points about that, and we'll get to the substance of that debate in a second. That situation is an extremely narrow slice of the fatal operations of drones, not just on U.S. nationals, but on high-value targets. So I'll give you a couple of figures. One, U.S. nationals, talking 3, maybe a few more, known U.S. nationals killed, out of a universe of between Pakistan and Yemen and other Somalia, et cetera, close to 5,000. High-value targets in Pakistan, high-value targets, according to figures in the CNN, Peter Bergen, who gets his information and has said as much from high-level U.S. authorities, high-value targets killed on the order of 50, less than 2% of those who are killed. So the people who are being killed are either low-level militants, nobodies, as it were, or civilians. And there's very, very little doubt about that. And the why of that is a thing called the signature strike. So there's been some hand-wringing and some concern in Congress and a 13-hour filibuster until the call of nature got the better of Rand Paul. And a great deal of concern about targeting of high-value terrorist suspects and U.S. nationals in particular, but almost nothing about signature strikes. And signature strikes is where the vast majority of kills have occurred, and it's what should really concern us. And it is certainly what should concern us if we think we believe in human rights, as opposed to, I think U.S. nationals should have particular rights. If you believe in human rights, you think human beings should have rights, okay? It's a very important difference. Unfortunately, it's 24/7 in our culture that we divide up human beings based on nationality, ethnicity, and other factors, and grieve their loss in differing levels. But if you take the core principle of human rights, which is fairly revolutionary, is the idea that all human beings have the same set of rights, then we're missing the big picture, which is the 98% of the kills who are not high-value targets. And most of them are killed through signature strikes. Signature strikes are strikes in which someone who is viewing the video feed from drone cameras observes the actions of people on the ground somewhere, and from somewhere like Creech Air Force Base in Nevada or the Pentagon or we don't know where, decides that the activity it has the signature of the behavior of militants excuse me, who might be dangerous to the U.S. or U.S. interests. And based on that, an authorization is made somehow, and we don't know, this is secret, but an authorization is given for a person then to authorize the drone to fire a missile to kill the targets. We have no idea what the basis is. We got a white paper leak about high-value targets and U.S. nationals. We don't know what the decision-making process is for signature strikes other than it is responsible for killing a lot of people. And then there's something else, and I don't want to go lawyer on you, but I will briefly. And I know that there's some law students in here, so at least one. I met one JD student who's like running the conference. Imad, where are you? Okay, so at least he'll follow this. And this is not difficult to follow. And the reason why I want to raise this is because we should be concerned when law is misused. And we shouldn't say, oh, that's legal stuff. Let the lawyers handle it, because that actually facilitates distortion and manipulation. So there's a concept in when I said it's not enough that someone's a militant. In order to organize their kill in certain contexts, and this has to do with IHL, but if you're in a context in which imminence is relevant, and it's relevant for a lot of the kills by drones, then the standard for imminence in international law for a century and a half has been this. A threat is imminent. Something is imminent. Imminent disaster. You have a lay understanding of what something is imminent is going to mean. It's not like you can't say that, oh, my June final is imminent. It's not. It's in June. It's way down the road, right? So, I'll give you in sort of academic terms. Something instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. That has been the standard for a century and a half. In the white paper that was leaked, this is what the attorneys who some think might be spinning to reach a particular goal in terms of authorizing particular conduct. The condition that an operational leader presented an imminent threat of violent attack on the United States does not require the United States to have clear evidence that a specific attack on U.S. persons' interests will take place in the immediate future. Imminence is not imminence, okay? So we should be worried when we see these sorts of distortions of law occurring. Some of you, I hope, most of you, I would pray, all of you are maybe familiar with the torture memos and remember the pushback and that occurred over the torture memos, where the definition of torture was contorted so that waterboarding didn't fit into torture, right? And this is, I think, a similar instance of misrepresentation of law. Okay, I'm going to flag one or two more issues, and I will be done in a minute, and then we can address issues or not on Q&A. The Congressional Research Service has reached this conclusion, which should be very disturbing to us. And this is the idea that messaging to Pakistan appears to continue to be part of the drone program's intent. In the back, we have a report on the site Living Under Drones, the same site that had that video, so if you're interested, in which we chart in the back drone strikes over a period of time, and we indicate the political context. And one of the things we found is that there are valleys and peaks in drone activity that correspond to bilateral U.S.-Pakistan relations. And that's important for two reasons. One, what effect does this have on Pakistani democracy if the United States can twist arms as it needs or as it sees fit by intensifying drone strikes? One. And two, shouldn't it make us question the assertions that all drone strikes are done only when there is an imminent threat? If you can turn the button on and off based on political criteria, doesn't that suggest that maybe that whole imminence assertion is without merit? I'll just run through these and we'll wrap up here. The strategic considerations, this is the point about how few people are killed on your right. In the video we talk about the recruitment effect for Al-Qaeda. There are also important issues in terms of the credibility of the United States. The figure now is that nearly 3/4 of Pakistanis consider the United States an enemy. The United States and Pakistan, in theory, are working together in counterterrorism efforts. And there's also the issue of precedence. And here, these are issues that I'd love to get your input on. What's the effect on Pakistani democracy? What's the effect on human rights in Pakistan? There's recent polling data, but we're showing very low levels of support among youth. I heard something on NPR a couple of nights ago. Belief in democracy, and many of you know much more about this than I do, but how does the incapacity of civil authorities to control the military or to stop drones, whatever their public discourse is, how does that affect the strength of the democratic movement in country? What is the effect on human rights advocates? And I can talk about that in Q&A. This is a bit about the debate today, but we addressed this, some more on legal findings. And let me just flag an issue which might be of interest historically. There is no specific international legal framework on weaponized drones. Now, that should concern us for many reasons, but one, because of the way in which drones have been used and the damage they have and destruction that they have wrought to date. But I would just like to suggest that we can look at that in two ways and look at two historical examples. Okay? The first historical example are chemical and biological weapons, which were used during World War I and which caused horrific death and maiming and injury in the trench warfare of World War I. Okay? Example one. The second example is nuclear weapons. And just why I give those two examples. After World War I, after chemical and biological weapons had been used and their toxic, inhumane effects had been documented, there was an international effort to prescribe, to prohibit the use of chemical and biological weapons. Example one. Example two, nuclear weapons used evidently in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the Second World War, after which the regime that has come into play is a non-proliferation regime in which we got them and our friends have them or whoever else has them, but you can't have them, okay?
I would describe that as a suboptimal legal regime. There are other regimes, legal regimes, such as no legislation, no international treaties, which is what we have now. The fact that drones have been used does not necessarily require that there can be no rollback. So that's why I started with the chemical and biological weapons example, because there can still be some sort of international community response and a decision that we don't think these weapons should be used. We think that they're highly dangerous. We think that they facilitate the recourse to death and destruction as opposed to negotiation and other forms of dispute settlement, et cetera, et cetera. So this is still possible, and this is something that our clinic and others are working on. So I'm going to stop there. I know I've gone over a bit. I apologize, Madiha, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm primarily a journalist, and I've been working on this video, and it's caused me to think a lot about stories and what we do with stories. And I was just reading something, and there's a quote I wanted to start with, which is Charles Reznikoff, who's a poet. He published a book of poetry called Testimony, the U.S. in 1978. And what the poetry was short poem sentence extractions from courtroom witness statements that he turned into poetry. And of this collection of poetry, Charles Bernstein, who's a literary theorist, said, quote, "The acknowledgement of these peripheral stories turns a wasteland into holy ground." So if, as you saw the Pashtun proverb, by the time the truth arrives, lies will have laid waste villages. We hope that it is through these stories that we can actually understand and reclaim that space and turn it into holy ground and rehumanize people. We've talked a lot about rights today. I think we've talked less about who is the human, who is the subject of these rights, and what kinds of affects, ideas, thoughts, sensibilities, dispositions people have to express in order to be considered people to the kind of human who has rights. So let me just start a little bit historically. In 1897, a journalist did come through the north of Pakistan, not exactly Waziristan, but in this area, telling his stories. And, that was Winston Churchill, and he talked a lot about the savages in this area impelled by fanaticism. And for Winston Churchill, he was very clear about the moral correctness of burning villages as collective punishment, which is what the British were doing at that time. For the British, the reasons for the revolt that actually cropped up in these areas had nothing to do with British practices, but had more to do with the constitutive lawlessness and religious fanaticism of the Pashtuns. By 1919, Churchill had become Secretary for Air and Power, and at that time the airplane was a fledgling weapon. He ordered the bombing of Jalalabad in Afghanistan, and when people in the tribal areas here rose to support people in Jalalabad, he also had them bombed. So the stories that they told about this place, the British, is about the place of savages, as I said, impelled by fanaticism. And those stories had their effects on FATA, the federally administrated tribal areas. And that's part of the structure of terror. And it's part of the storytelling is part of the structure, not just of humanization, but also of terrorism. And it can be, it can be about humanization, but it can also be about control. Terror, in other words, doesn't begin with legal machinations or redefinitions. It begins with the stories we tell ourselves and about others. For the U.S. today, the tribal areas have been refashioned into America's Wild West, an idea that once legitimized genocide in North America and is today being applied at the margins in Pakistan. It is not accidental, for example, that the hunt for Osama bin Laden, whom many thought was hiding in the tribal areas, was codenamed Geronimo. FATA, in actual fact, it's constantly referred to as being remote and lawless. It's actually not that remote. It's about a 6 to 8 hour drive. Waziristan, which is where the majority of these attacks are happening, particularly in North Waziristan. It's about a 6 to 8 hour drive to the town next to it, which is Bannu, which is on the border. And another half an hour would put you inside Waziristan. FATA is also not lawless. No less than 6 security forces of various forms are part of the security apparatuses of the Pakistani state. And together these forces did what they were supposed to do for a long time. Many of them, in fact, have their roots in during the time of British colonial rule. They kept the population, quote unquote, pacified, and they produced the buffer zone that first the British and then the Pakistani state and then the US in the 80s needed against Afghanistan and then later against the Soviet Union. So the descriptors remote and lawless are continually repeated as if they were a natural feature of the landscape in this area. You'll see them constantly repeated if you read the New York Times or really any of the mainstream media. In fact, I find that many of the popular descriptions one finds about FATA are either paraphrased or sometimes even lifted word for word from the memoirs of British soldiers. They, of course, thought of the place as forbidding and remote because they were trying to run imperial military campaigns there. But these descriptions have echoed through history to the present. And in that sense, FATA is literally the creation of white men. And it's in this context that I've been thinking about stories, about testimony, about witnessing, and how we approach the stories of others, as lawyers, as journalists, as scholars, as activists, as readers, and as listeners. As Jim pointed out earlier, I think much of the mainstream drone debate has mainly circled around the question of civilians and militants. So if the right is looking for absolute militants, the left is busy looking for perfect victims. Indeed, the strategic emphasis on the deaths of women and children among anti-war activists belies a desire to find perfect victims, those who could never be suspected of being a militant. I'm sorry, I just realized I didn't start my timer. Our stories as journalists are then framed by this debate. And this debate originates, in a sense, in a legal principle, the question of proportionality. How many people can we kill? How much collateral damage is acceptable? And that, has its own lineage in the law, but a fairly reductive version of that issue has been popularized by journalists and the mainstream media. It has spawned databases from the Long War Journal, which is a conservative end, to the New America Foundation, which is the more sort of established mainstream, to the Bureau for Investigative Journalists, which I think has the most sound statistics on the issue. So this question has become the major frame for stories. And so, for example, Scott Shane, who is a journalist for the New York Times, writing a news analysis for that paper, effectively argued, he was actually quoting someone, but it was part of an argument that amounted to the fact that since only 20% of the dead are innocent, according to some databases, drones are justifiable. 20% is a proportional, justifiable loss. I want to make 2 notes about that here. The first is about numbers, in particular about percentages and how they work. Percentages, as you know, are ratios, and ratios do this interesting thing, which is that, for example, if you have 20 people who are innocent out of the 100 that you kill, you're at 20%, so you're within the justifiable proportional loss. Now, if you kill 40 people out of 200, you've killed twice as many people who are innocent, but yet it's still within the 20%. In other words, as you kill more and more people, you get to kill more and more people. And you get to kill more and more innocents as well. The more destruction you cause, the more you are allowed to cause. The second thing I want to point out about this is the title of the article, which was titled "The Moral Case for Drones." So what you have here is a journalistic discourse that conflates legal questions with moral ones. It mistakes the law for ethics, and it mistakes the question of rights, which I think is a more conservative question, with the more radical question of justice. Certainly this conflation is encouraged, I think, by some legal conferences, and I've been going to them as part of this, because of my interest in the war on terror and targeted killing and drones. It's very common now to see the terms moral and ethical thrown into panels that are essentially actually legal panels, as if moral and ethical were synonyms for the law. But the discourse has really been popularized and made hegemonic by the mainstream media. So the law as ethics orients us towards a particular kind of view towards other people's stories. It orients us towards a juridical view. We don't listen to what people are trying to tell us. Rather, we listen with suspicion to ferret out who is a real victim and who is not, and just how many, to separate the truth from the lies. The ideology of objectivity that is so prevalent in American journalism further exacerbates this issue, laying stress on a kind of vulgar empiricism and a pedantic obsession with particular kinds of facts to the exclusion of others. So, for example, the Stanford report was, in some quarters, I think, wrongly and unjustifiably attacked by some right-wing experts. Those experts were aided by journalists with a claim that the study hadn't pursued a random sampling method, which, if you know anything about this kind of stuff, it's kind of ridiculous to think that. I mean, I don't know of any human rights report that has actually done a random sample kind of methodology. Without such a method, the report, according to these critics, could not be considered truthful. And when I had this argument with a journalist from one of the mainstream presses, this person suggested that perhaps I didn't understand math. Rather, I suspect this person and others do not understand methodology. But now we have a series: law, math, ethics. What the reduction of the entire space of debate and discussion to legal issues means, once again, is that journalists are also caught up in a discourse around transparency and accountability. And I think here maybe I somewhat disagree with Jim. I do think that this is something that should be left to the lawyers, that kind of discourse. The law is, after all, constitutively about upholding the established order and working within the system. It cannot be otherwise. And maybe transparency and accountability is the best the system can offer. But the truth is, never have I ever heard a single one of these people that I have talked to from the tribal areas who's affected by drones tell me that they wanted a little more transparency and accountability from the American government. They simply want the bombing to stop, and they want the U.S. to get out of Afghanistan, and they say that across the board. So from that perspective, from their perspective, this is what power looks like. The question of transparency and accountability is a pseudo-problem for them. It's an abstract problem that has very little to do with the concrete fact of their daily murder. And it is at this point that I begin to wonder what it is that we do when we mobilize testimony towards agendas and goals that are fairly removed from the articulations of these affectees. So now, as I said, we have a series, law, math, and ethics, and they form a certain kind of limited discourse. And it is towards this discourse that I think testimony is often mobilized. We as journalists, as activists, as lawyers, mobilize testimony to create affect in order to try and get a reader to empathize with people. And by empathy, I should make clear here that I'm not simply talking about a private emotion, human emotion that we all have, but I think empathy now has become a structuring mode of liberal politics. So instead of talking about politics explicitly, we actually think that empathy in some ways underwrites some essential humanness, and that this would be enough to get people to respond. We accept people who are on the receiving end of power, like these affectees, as objects of pity, but not as agents necessarily in their own right. So let me explain that by way of an example. Last October, activists from the U.S. had come to Pakistan to express solidarity with the survivors of these drone attacks, and they did a march to South Waziristan, to the border. The delegation had been organized by Code Pink, which is a feminist organization. Madiha Benjamin, the founder of Code Pink, would later write about her meeting with Kareem Khan, who is one of the people that you saw. He lost a son and a brother on December 31st, 2009. And what I want to focus on is her writing on this subject, and it's out there. You can find it on Common Dreams and the Code Pink blog and whatever. First, Benjamin expressed some surprise about Kareem and described him in the following way, quote, Khan, a large man in his late 50s with striking features, including a long beard and wearing traditional tribal garb, I don't know what that means, surprised the group when he revealed that he spoke English and has worked as a journalist for outlets such as Al Jazeera, end quote. I think the description is less instructive about Kareem than Benjamin's world, in which there appears to be an incoherence between quote-unquote traditional tribal garb and speaking English and working as a journalist. A delegation member asked Kareem whether he would accept monetary compensation or an apology from the US government. Kareem replied, and again, all of these quotes I'm drawing from Madiha Benjamin's article. Kareem replied, quote, "I will never forget or forgive what the Americans did, and if I had the chance to kill an American soldier, I would do it," end quote. Benjamin further recounted the episode this way. She says, "This seemed inconsistent coming from an educated man, a journalist, who until then had maintained a warm demeanor. He seemed very far from someone who would pick up a gun. Some people in the delegation were clearly jarred by this blunt response, thinking he seemed like someone who would pursue a more nonviolent approach," end quote. Khan's inconsistency clearly presented a challenge to the delegation. First, a member of the delegation intended to convince Khan of the wrongness of his position. So, and again, this is a quote from Benjamin's piece. A member of Veterans for Peace tried to convince Khan that it wouldn't be right to exact revenge upon U.S. soldiers because they are not the ones responsible for the policy. But Khan would have none of it. Quote, "I hold the American soldiers directly responsible for the death of our loved ones," he said. "They should not even be in this region." Khan insisted that there would never be peace until the Americans left Afghanistan. End quote. Kareem, in other words, rejected the fine distinctions that place American soldiers beyond the pale of culpability, even as they commit crimes. So in a final attempt, after this meeting ended between the activists and Kareem, another delegation member tried to wrest an answer from Kareem that would be more acceptable to the group. Benjamin explains this as an attempt at clarification. So the delegation member asked Kareem what he would do if he had a drone and whether he would attack the US. Kareem was, quote, "astonished at the mere suggestion," end quote, according to Benjamin. He responded that he would not. This moment then finally provides the sought-after resolution for the group. Benjamin goes on to say that the delegation member was, quote, "moved by Khan's insistence that innocents not be caught up in his desire for revenge," end quote. Innocents here actually refers to Americans, an overwhelming majority of whom actually support the bombing in Fatah, and not Kareem and those living in Fatah. In other words, what I think activists, or some activists, come looking for is a perfect victim, an embodiment of the sad, sorrowful, traumatized, helpless figure. And I use the term figure deliberately to mean both a human and a number. That is, they're looking for, it's about the conflation of actual living human beings with the little numbers that appear under the civilian category column in various databases that count up the drone attacks. And I take these remarks in this struggle to say something about the way liberal empathy works, about the kinds of affective dispositions liberal activists, and I think the consumers of the American media more generally, seem to need in order to find certain lives grievable. Liberal empathy is not so much about the conditions of those doing the talking, it's about producing a certain subjective experience for the journalist's audience, our readers, our viewers, our listeners. And it is in this sense that actually Talal Asad has compared liberal empathy to pornography, because it is fundamentally concerned with the experience it produces in the viewer. So when Kareem Khan denies that to activists, it immediately becomes a problem. I think, secondly, empathy in this mode of politics, I would say, is about control, in that it is about delimiting the conditions under which those on the receiving end of power can express themselves. And finally, the search for perfect victims on whom we can bestow our empathy misunderstands the dialogic nature of violence in general, and in Waziristan in particular. Put simply, actions produce reactions. The Pakistani government has used the rhetoric around Pashtun honor, around tribal independence, for its own ends, letting Fatah languish and claiming that it was preserving Pashtun traditions. In truth, Fatah has been governed severely and for a long time. Pakistan inherited the Byzantine administrative system established by the British, and Fatah still occupies a different legal sphere than the rest of Pakistan. It is still governed under British-era 1901 regulations, by and large, that are known among the people as the Black Laws. The FCR allows for collective punishment of an entire tribe or area, bans independent media, doesn't allow a court system, and instead gives the political agent appointed by the federal government overwhelming powers. Between the security forces and these laws, innocence and guilt have for a long time been arbitrary here, each being determined according to the caprices of the state and its agents rather than about the welfare of the people. How that system works and continually fails people here is evident in a recurring pattern. So, for example, in 2004, the Pakistani government had set up an agreement called the Shakai Agreement, which fell apart, and trying to sort of control the militancy in the region. And when that fell apart, the Pakistani government, through its political agent, basically put an economic blockade on Waziristan for months. And this obviously drove people towards insurgents who they thought might actually protect them, and towards resistance against the Pakistani state. More recently, the Waziristan political agent this December imposed a ban on receiving any government documents, passports, national identity cards, property papers, as collective punishment of the local population for complying with the insurgents' ban on polio vaccinations. And currently, as we speak, actually, North Waziristan is under a 24-hour curfew following the killing of several Pakistani soldiers from a blast. And supplies, I was just on the phone a couple of days ago, supplies are basically running out. They relaxed the curfew for a few hours for people to go out after several days, but it's continuing unless today it stopped. I haven't had time to check today, but I don't think so. So there are ways of hearing other people's stories. Journalists, activists, lawyers at some level see themselves as witnesses, those who can attest or give testimony. But what sort of testimony is needed now is the question, and I don't necessarily have an answer to this. I mean, I would say that there is an alternative model. For example, there is the idea of bearing witness in religion. I'm not necessarily arguing for theology here, but my point is that there are other ways of orienting ourselves towards the stories of other people than looking at them through, a very kind of vulgar empiricist lens. Actually, for those who could understand, they often give us the wrong date for these attacks, and you have to go figure out what the right date is, because they don't live in a situation where they mark their daily lives with calendars. But it doesn't necessarily make their testimony less compelling. I think now actually there is a move towards some sort of normalization of drones, right? There are talks about the drone rules being written down by the Obama administration. So, and maybe drone courts happening, that's been thrown out there. But so there is a move in that direction, and the real question is to disaggregate the legal questions from the questions of justice, and to ask ourselves whether if everything was legal, would the war still be just? I think I'll end there. Thank you.
We're going to start the question and answer portion now. If anyone has a question, stand up. Yes, or you can sit down. This is on you. Oh, okay.
Professor James. So there seems to be like a miscommunication about drone attacks here in the United States. What is the best way to educate the general American public regarding the drones attack when they're only getting news from the media, the corporate media, and it's very narrow? What is like the best way to kind of not have this miscommunication about drones in like the general public in the United States?
So I think it's a really good question, and I would say can be answered at many levels. And I would remit to Madiha's analysis, which I think was brilliant and really frames a lot of what's done in the field of human rights. There's another law professor who refers to the savages, victims, savior triad. So the savages are whoever it is that's committing the rights abuses there, and then the victims are these one-dimensional, agency-free, pure victims with no taint of any desire for revenge, for instance, in the particular instance that she was talking about, and deconstructing the analysis or the writing of Madiha Benjamin. And then the savior are the Western informed NGOs who can document the narratives of the victims and use them in part of an advocacy campaign to promote some sort of intervention from, again, the savior class, whatever that is, the European Union, the United Nations, very top-down, first world comes to the rescue of the poor brown people in a sort of a modernized Rudyard Kipling-esque fashion, right? So that, anyhow, I'm just, there's a frame out there. There's an analytical pre-existing context into which a lot of what we do in human rights takes place. So my first point is just to recognize that a lot of what Madiha is saying is accurate, and I accept it. And I think as a human rights activist, another friend of mine refers to ambivalent activism. Has written a piece on ambivalent activism, which is sort of based on the idea, okay, yeah, Madiha and others, and the way you frame this in the context of North Waziristan, you're right. A lot of what is done in the short term to try to have some kind of impact on public opinion and then also policymakers is done for reasons of efficacy and expedience in an understandable language. And the understandable language is finding someone who, oh, how curious, he's wearing that traditional garb and still speaks English. So yeah, there's some of that. And when I do it, I feel ambivalent about it. But with all of that said, and the answer to your question, I'm starting from layers of abstraction down to the concrete, is a lot of what I think can be done is to personalize narratives and to bring home to people in the United States the idea that there are ordinary human beings who, but for the grace of God, might be them, whoever it is the audience is, people in the United States or in Western Europe, but they're born in another part of the world and they have another faith and they have another lifestyle, who, because of the geopolitical decisions made by particular groups like Al-Qaeda and others, they live in the vicinity of locales where particular terrorist activity may or may not be occurring, and because of that their lives are hell. And we as Americans are subjecting other people to that. So I think that's the message. And by the way, let me just make a point. I'm a lawyer, but still a nice guy. And a lot of what we did in the report we wrote, the Stanford NYU report, is to frame drone strikes within law. And part of why we do that is because we think that there has been a good deal of distortion of the law and failure to comply with the law. That said, I recognize, because I'm also an academic, that there are serious deficiencies in the existing legal frameworks. And as someone who is, in addition to being a human rights lawyer and a prof at Stanford, I'm also someone concerned about social justice. And on this issue, drones, I think there are arguments to be made in law. There are arguments to be made in public policy.
There are arguments to be made in strategic language. So this sort of action will produce more people who want to harm the United States. There are arguments to be made about the impact on U.S. democracy. One of the worst things about drones is they are part of a dangerous trend of accretion of power by the executive without adequate oversight by the legislative branch, by civil society, and by media and the public at large. So there are many different kinds of arguments that can be deployed, and I think they all ought to be deployed. And none of the arguments which I've cited so far are moral arguments. So I take Madiha's point, I think it's dead on, is the idea that there should or is a conflation between law and morality is highly problematic. And on this issue of drones, I think one of the main arguments that we need to make, and we being human rights organizations and civil society groups, and groups maybe not as bound by law as a clinic at Stanford Law School, right? Some of I kind of got my hands tied if you think about it, okay? But some of us who aren't at the human rights clinic at Stanford Law School should be thinking about deploying arguments that are fundamentally ethical and moral. What kind of a nation do we want to be? Do we want to be, and this is the nation we are descriptively. We are a nation that thinks that there's some minimal chance that you or others in your cohort might harm Americans, that we preemptively can decide and effectuate your death from above with no risk to U.S. forces. That's who we are as a nation. That is descriptive. Is that who we want to be as a nation? When you wake up in the morning, do you think, I hope I can preemptively, in some way, contribute to the death of someone who might be conceivably harboring some ill will towards the United States, and if I have to take out X percent or 30% or 70% of people who have to be within the range of destruction, I'll do that. I don't. That's not like what I think the United States could or should be. So I've gone on for a bit, but sorry. That's the answer to your question, or my answer to it.
So you talked about the trend of increasing executive power with limited oversight by the legislative branch, and recently we've also seen the prosecution or the attempted prosecution of organizations like WikiLeaks as well as Bradley Manning. So my question is, based on what's been going on with the drone strike program and sort of this increase in an outcry by human rights organizations and by professionals like yourselves, in what direction do you see the U.S. government moving as far as its transparency on the issue and its message to the public? Do you see more transparency in the future, less transparency in the future, or the same?
Yes, I can speak to that, and I think Madiha may have some observations as well. One, I think, in part because of the work that Madiha has done, and some of what she's written, and some of what others have written, not just on Pakistan, but also Jeremy Scahill's work on Yemen. So just some data, information that has made it into the mainstream media in the United States, again, through the filters, with the pushback of the critique that you didn't do a scientific survey, and put a footnote, I'll say something about that, which is the point you raised. But with all those limits, and with the fact that anytime you talk to the Washington Post or New York Times and you say something critical of the administration, they feel obliged to go and give the administration 2 paragraphs, generally before your 2 paragraphs, to frame the debate. With all of those limits, I think there has been a movement in the public debate to one in which there's now greater understanding of the consequences of drones and greater concern that there may be an excess in the attribution or the seizure of power to by the executive, depending on how you observe that phenomenon. Okay, so I think we're moving, we have been moving as a society in the right direction. That said, one of the things that concerns me about drones, and one of the reasons why I think drones are worthy of analysis, apart from and not only within the analysis given to targeted killings, is the nature of the weapon. And the way the weapon presents a threat to transparency and democratic rule. So let me say what I mean, and then I'll get to the point. There's been a process, if you look at it over the past few decades or more, in which U.S. military intervention overseas has sought to minimize the possibility of U.S. casualties. So one example of that is Kosovo, where you have ethnic cleansing going on in real time, and rather than putting boots on the ground to try to stop that, sorties are flowing at 30,000 feet, because that is the way that you minimize the possibility of U.S. casualties, right? So the operational decisions are made based on the weapons and the technology of warfare, as opposed to what would be the best means of intervening in a particular context, okay? Drones represent the final step in that progression. Actually, the final step is on the way as well. It's weaponized drones that are also capable of making decisions. Okay, so that really should scare the bejeebers out of us. All right, but drones are pretty darn close to the end of the line. And what the end of the line does is it allows the executive to carry on several simultaneous military campaigns with not just engagement or control by Congress, which in the Constitution is charged with the authority to declare war. Forgotten provision, hadn't really been implemented since 1941. But not only with the exclusion of Congress's control, but Congress is unaware of what's happening. Congressional committees have been asking for months, we would like to see the memos that provide the basis for these attacks or those attacks or these drone attacks or signature strikes, and they don't get them. So as far as our polity is concerned, we should be very concerned by drones. And collectively, I don't think we are. I mean, we go about our ordinary lives and, you know, oh yeah, I guess we were killing a bunch of people over there in Pakistan, and, you know, what's on MTV, you know, whatever. And you know, it concerns me, and I think we should be concerned at a visceral level about, you know, what our democracy is doing and what our role in that democracy is. So that's the downside. On the one hand, I think the debate has gotten better. On the other hand, I think there's not nearly enough concern about this issue as there should be.
So you asked us the question, what kind of nation do you want to be? Do we want to be? I just want to bring up two journalists, Pakistani journalists, one by the Daily named Farhat Taj, the other by the Dawn named Irfan Hussain, who have in January of 2010 and 11 come out in favor of drone strikes, saying that they're liberating the region from al-Qaeda rule, and saying that a removal of the drone strikes would further implement al-Qaeda rule in the region and create a backlash against the citizens there. So if one were to make the argument that we're defending that area from al-Qaeda oppression, what would your response be?
So I would have several responses. First, I would ask, sort of as a rhetorical question, if there were an al-Qaeda cell in the banlieue of, you know, outside Paris, does anyone in this room think that the United States would engage through drones? My guess is that probably no one would believe that that would be an appropriate or suitable or politically viable option, one. And then two, I would say, I personally tend to believe that the kind of response that the United States should have taken from the inception of the post 9/11 era should be a vigorous law enforcement, international global law enforcement effort, right? If you think about what the United States is doing, it doesn't have boots on the ground in North Waziristan. It's not engaged in controlling territory. It's engaged in identifying individuals and killing them, right? And then the question would be, well, if you can identify individuals, and purportedly the United States has been able to do this, why not identify them and capture them, seize them? And some of the answer to that might have to do with the political difficulties from the prior administration with regard both to enhanced interrogation, aka torture, and Guantanamo, aka unlimited permanent detention. And if that's the case, it would be very difficult to make an ethical argument for the let's kill them rather than detain them and hold them somewhere where there might be significant political pushback. So that's probably a long answer to your question, but I resist the implicit choice in that question, in the question and the writings of the two Pakistani journalists you cite, that if drones are not used, then the only other option is a full-scale invasion, in which would have higher costs to civilians. Right? I think there are other options, and the reason why I give France or England as an example to juxtapose it is because the United States, with its counterparts in those countries and many other countries, is engaged in robust law enforcement, and it does that in part because it is widely viewed as the only option, because it can't fire drones in Paris, but in Pakistan you can fire drones, so let's just fire drones, right? I think that's there's a bit of a lack of intellectual discipline in the analysis of the problem.
Madiha, you're also going to respond to that question.
Yeah,
Could you speak into the mic because we've got a lot
Sure.
of people on the overflow.
Yeah. So the two journalists that you mentioned, Farhad Taj, who sometimes says she's Dr. Farhad Taj, although I'm not sure she actually has a doctorate. No, I'm in all seriousness, I'm not actually sure she has a doctorate. I don't know. But the reality is she came out with this one survey at this Ariana Institute that she supposedly heads, which we don't know where it comes from. She came out with this one survey that supposedly showed that the majority of people in FATA, and particularly in Waziristan, supported drone attacks. Now, neither I nor any journalist that I know has actually ever been able to get the methodology of her survey from Farhad Taj. She'll give you the like percentages to her answers, but the usual stuff that you need, like what was your margin of your size, your sampling size, what was your margin of error, et cetera, et cetera. None of that. As soon as you ask her that, they just fall silent and they stop responding to your queries. So we'll just leave that there. As for Irfan Hussain, he's also, he served on the board of an AstroTurf Israeli lobbying organization that was calling for the normalization between Pakistan and Israel. And there is an entire there is an entire infiltration actually happening in the Pakistani media, particularly in the English language media, by interests outside of Pakistan that are paying people to write things, to write these kinds of things. And most of what Irfan Hussain writes, actually he uses Farhad Taj, her survey, which is of dubious reputation, to buttress his claims. So I mean, that's not really an argument. We have to separate out, what are the actual issues from people who are just muddying the ground, and these guys are just muddying the ground. As for the actual issue about Al-Qaeda, look, there's a lot of things happening on the ground. There are a vast number of groups. They have multiplied. They're splintered, and you can see that they're splintered by the fact that they send out and give various kinds of statements that they then take back, and then somebody else will give another statement. So there's internal jockeying going on. The issue is, these guys are ruthless, and we should not obviously forget that. And they also leave people, just like drone attacks, they also leave people in pieces. The thing is that because the Pakistani state has continued to deal with what I was saying in my talk, has continued to deal with the people of FATA not as Pakistani citizens with, certain kinds of rights, but actually as it's still continuing that relationship of indirect rule. It's collectively punishing the population. They view them basically as internal others, right? There's a 24-hour curfew going on in Waziristan. That's not a small thing. Let's not brush that aside. These are precisely the things that give rise to the resistance. With the actual core, we don't know what it is. It may be quite small, but people go in and out of these things out of frustration and out of very local concerns that have nothing to do with this broader business of Al-Qaeda, et cetera. They may later get pulled into that. But the primary point is that this is a political problem, and you cannot kill your way out of a political problem. You just cannot do it.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Madiha. James, you've also brought good weather with you from California. Thank you for that. So my question, I want to go from a micro level to more global level, and I want to talk about global governance for a second. So moving away from, I mean, the way I think about foreign policy, American foreign policy, is it's not made for the next 15, 20 years the way it's made in Pakistan. It's made for the next 100, 200, 300 years. And thinking about very long term, America wants to move away from our region, wants to move to contain China, the growth of China, the growth of Far East. So they obviously want to take away the foot soldiers, and they want to implement this drone program. So my view on the drones is more pessimistic than, but I give you full credit for the work that you're doing, especially you, James, not being a Pakistani. You know, you're doing a good thing for us. But my question is that in terms, like, so your lessons for the Pakistani government, how much of, in your work, did you have interaction with the Pakistani government, especially with the Pakistani intelligence? Did you speak to them about their own perspective on how would they, I mean, I know they want to take control of the drone program and they want to launch it from their own bases, but that's not going to happen. So what is their perspective, in your opinion? And after the US withdrawal in 2014, which they say that they will, what do you think is going to be the impact on this region, from both from a Pakistani government perspective as well as on a more global scale, in a, let's say in a more zero governance world?
I'll speak briefly, and then Madiha may have some comments. First, I'll just I want to challenge part of your assertion, and that is the idea that drone practices are designed for not for 15 or 20 years, but for 200 or 300 years. I sometimes get the feeling that drone practices are designed for the next 15 or 20 minutes. In that I think one of the recurring problems of US foreign policy, and there may be no better region than Fatah, Afghanistan, and Pakistan to demonstrate this, one of the recurring problems is that the short-term interests are so paramount that there's a failure to appreciate the midterm and long-term consequences of US actions. And you know, you see this with the Mujahideen and the creation, in effect, of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and resistance. And I think you have a similar phenomenon with the ISI and the Pakistani government support of groups to fight in Afghanistan, some of whom turn around and then become enemies of the Pakistani state. So I would sort of at least problematize the idea that there's a grand 200 or 300 year plan. I think at times, if you look at the behavior of U.S. foreign policy in particular, you know, one is tempted to say this might help you in 6 months or a year or 2 years, but what is going to be the fallout of this? And I think with weaponized drones, there's been an utter failure to appreciate the dangerous consequences of the proliferation of weaponized drones. You know, if China decides to use weaponized drones, you know, against Uyghurs, you know, if Assad decides to attack Syrian opposition elements in France or God knows where in Morocco, you know, the potential for escalating conflicts and for provoking more intense and entangled global conflicts is great, and I don't think that there has been hard thinking about those consequences in planning out on Terror Tuesdays who will be struck. We met with all sorts of stakeholders, governmental authorities, parliamentarian, civil society, etc. In terms of your question, I would just remit to the experts on Pakistan who are in the room, including Madiha and others who I see in front of me, who probably have much more basis for answering the question about how Pakistani intelligence sees these issues. From what we understand, yes, they would like to have drones. There's a lot of suspicion that some drone strikes have been orchestrated by Pakistani intelligence through the information provision so that certain targets are hit who are useful, or whose elimination is useful for Pakistan more than for the United States, etc. So all of that is sort of part of what's discussed, but I don't purport to be able to speak with any high level of accuracy about the understandings of Pakistani intelligence and governmental officials on these topics.
I mean, I have also met with ISI officials and military officials off and on, and they admit that there was complicity with the United States. They claim that now it's no longer the case, that they get these faxes, but that they don't respond. You might have heard the story about faxes, I hope. So, I mean, part of it's really difficult to know what's going on internally with the ISI and with the military. I mean, I think partly because there's a lot of internal segments of the ISI and segments of the military, I mean, internally are trying to figure this thing out, so it's very hard, and they're not actually very good at communicating to journalists. I mean, I know that journalists, or Pakistani journalists, sometimes say to them, like, look at what the American officials are doing. Like, why can't you tell us something sometimes? They, obviously, Pakistani journalists want their fair share of the leaks, but it doesn't really happen like that, I think partly because they're not used to being open, and it's actually, this is part of the media discipline that they are just now learning and starting to be disciplined into how to make this kind of stuff happen.
My question is about the future of drone warfare. So I see this as just an extension of like a incredibly irresponsible and aggressive American foreign policy that we've seen, over the past century. And I'm wondering how drone warfare is viewed by our administration. Is it viewed as something that could be an alternative to a full-scale intervention in areas like we had this war in Iraq, which the American public was increasingly disillusioned with, and so much of our resources went into. So is it being viewed as something that in the future could be an alternative to a full-scale intervention like that, or is it just another sort of political tool to twist the arms of other governments, as you mentioned in the Pakistani case?
I mean, I think part of the efficacy of drones as a technology is precisely that they're making Orwell come true, war is peace kind of stuff, so that even as the U.S. claims that it's going to be pulling troops out of Afghanistan, we actually, with drones, other officials have been saying that's not necessarily the case, because it's turning what drones as a technology do is like they're turning war into actually a policing operation, right? In which the U.S. gets to be the global policeman, doesn't have to deal with necessarily, putting its own soldiers on the line, and can actually act as the global policeman and as the sort of world sovereign through this technology, and which is able to be everywhere, so that the distinction between war and peace kind of disappears, basically.
Yeah, I'll just add a few comments and try to keep us on time without answering your question as it's phrased, but I may try to provide elements to give an answer. If you look at
the lessons of Vietnam as they are understood within the United States military, and there's a very good book on this by a professor named Andrew Bosevich, former military man, and is a professor at BU now in international affairs. But one of the lessons from the perspective of the military is that the cost of Vietnam politically, because 50,000 plus soldiers returned dead, because many thousands more returned home injured, and because there was a draft which would have taken people like you in this room and sent you to Vietnam if this were 1968 or 1969, et cetera. Those factors led to significant opposition to the war and to the military. And so you have two moves, and the drones represent one of these moves. One move is away from the draft to an all-volunteer army. And the all-volunteer army means that poor, lower status, and racial minorities disproportionately bear the brunt of military conflict when there is deployment of soldiers, as opposed to the situation 40 plus years ago with Vietnam. And two, a technological development that reduces the need to deploy U.S. troops. The combination of that is, and I won't say what the future will hold, is that the executive branch is able, in effect, to deploy small numbers of troops as needed and larger numbers of drones. And by the way, there are more pilots being trained to fly drones than there are being trained to fly airplanes. Footnote. So if you want to know which way we're headed, drones is unfortunately the way of the future. But it all tends towards, as I said earlier, an accretion of power in the executive and the ability to wage conflict / policing actions, if to use Madiha's term, in many different fronts around the globe without a significant risk of political consequence within the United States, right? And this is, I would bet a significant sum of money that if the folks in this room, I mean, not the folks my age, but the undergrads or students in this room were subject to be drafted to fight in North Waziristan, everyone on this campus would know where North Waziristan was, and everyone on this campus would have some sort of opinion about it. But as long as it's a far-off place that affects, those people over there, there's much less pushback. And it's a threat at one level, most importantly, to folks living in North Waziristan and elsewhere that the United States has decided are areas that need to be policed by drones, but it also is a threat to our democracy, world peace, et cetera.
Thank you, James, Madiha, and Mark. Our last guest speaker is an historian that almost needs no introduction. Ayesha Jalal is the Mary Richardson Professor of History and Director of Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies at the Tufts University. She is the author of numerous books on Pakistan and South Asian history, most recently, The Pity of Partition, Manto's Life, Times, and Work Across the Indian-Pakistan Divide.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to University of Michigan, and especially Farina Mir and the students for inviting me here. It's been a very wide-ranging discussion today, and it's not really a task that I relish trying to pull it all together, but I will try. There you are. Yeah, protests have already started. I mean, the discussion today has centered around two issues. One, of course, is Pakistan, broadly speaking, and Pakistan's democracy in particular, and the other is human rights. I'm not sure that we've necessarily given adequate attention. In fact, the last panel had more to say about human rights in Pakistan than the earlier ones, which were looking at Pakistan in terms of the context, the history, but that's perhaps unavoidable. So I'll keep myself on the ball because I was trying to take notes as best I could. But since you have mentioned Manto, and it is something very close to me, One thing that hasn't been said today, even though there has been talk of history, especially from Madiha today, that most of the problems of the subcontinent are inextricably linked with the moment of decolonization, the manner in which the British quit India. And I think that needs to be reiterated, not least because of this regard. And I'd like to begin with him just to sort of give you a flavor of at least the man's mind and how he captured the moment. The main newspaper headlines these days are about bloodshed. Saad Hassan Manto lamented. He was bewildered by the chaos and confusion attending the dawn of a long-awaited freedom. Why have human beings become so thirsty for human blood these days, he asked. Should we wash our hands off humanity? Have we lost faith in that thing called conscience? Not a day passed without a human being getting killed by a fellow human being. Scores ended up injured. Why are these few individuals so murderous? And why are their hearts and minds so possessed by murder and violence? Now before our eyes lie dried tracks of blood, cut up human parts, charred faces, mangled necks, terrified people, looted houses, burnt fields, mountains of rubble, and overflowing hospitals. We are free. Hindustan is free. Pakistan is free. And we are walking the desolate streets naked, without any possessions, in utter distress. Food was scarce, and essential commodities were expensive. There was famine. Diseases were spreading. There was no fire in the winter, and no water in the summer. The earth was scorched. The skies had receded. Everyone was busy trying to tackle the problems, but there was more noise and very little actual work. These observations about the depressing aftershocks of partition have a resonance well beyond the time in which they were written. It almost sounds like Pakistan today. The three panels have focused on three facets of the struggle for human rights in Pakistan, and I'm going to take them one by one. I think Mariam was very brave to try and address the large question of whether the elections are going to open up spaces for a more effective articulation of the discourse on human rights. Now, I think one of the great problems in Pakistan is that the understanding of democracy is very sort of problematic. The expectations of democracy are quite unrealistic. First of all, we keep hearing in Pakistan that democracy has failed. Democracy has failed. It always has failed. The politicians have failed. The fact is that the answer to that is not that you should throw democracy out, as often happens in the discourse in Pakistan, and that is a very important facet of Pakistan, that people really think that there ought to be a return to military dictatorship because that will solve Pakistan's problems. The problem is not the failure of democracy, because democracy has really been given a very poor chance in Pakistan, but really the fact that you need more democracy, not less. I think that's the fundamental issue. And it's interesting that you hear about corruption ad nauseum, but just look next door. And I've really been emphasizing this need to look next door. India, the world's largest democracy. God forbid a drone ever had to go to India. There would be uproar in the United States of America. That's the difference, the point you very aptly pointed out, James. So this is what I want to emphasize, that democracy in India is consisting of an enormous measure of corruption, but it does not result in a debate that we should stop the electoral process until we cleanse the system and become completely pure. I think this kind of unrealistic thinking about democracy in Pakistan simply has to go, and that can only be done with greater education. I also want to point out that not understanding the history and taking a very presentist view on the matter of democracy and human rights is a great mistake that is constantly made in Pakistan. I'd like to say that there is a difference between representative and participatory democracy. The democracy that Pakistan inherited at the time of 47 and barely managed to keep together and then steadily dismantled was at best a representative democracy. It was not meant to be a mass democracy. It was representation of the few in the interests of the few. And that has perpetuated itself in the post-47 scenario with all the military takeovers that we've had. I mean, they only represent their own interests. This fallacy that democracy will come and everything would be sorted out, the representatives will represent the interests of the represented, is really one of the great fallacies that the sooner the Pakistani populace understands, the better it would be. That is why over the last few decades, we have had another discourse of accountability. But the balance between accountability and casting the vote still needs to be established. The view that you can throw out a person with a view on so-called Pakistan's ideology, like Ayaz Amir, is ludicrous. And the sort of questions our newly independent election commission supposedly is allowing the returning officers to ask is an example of the very poorly established norms of democracy in the country. So what I want to say is that the first thing Pakistanis have to realize is that all the disaffection with politicians, with democracy, has to do in part with the way in which they perceive democracy. So I'd like to make a point about the distinction that we need to make between the formal electoral arenas of politics, the kind of arenas the British created, the inadequate representative arenas that we have simply built upon. We do have universal adult franchise, even if it came belatedly to us. The formal arenas of Pakistani politics, quite as much as in India, lack credibility. But in India, they don't talk about dismantling it. Why do you talk about dismantling it in terms of Pakistan? I think that's the first point I would like everybody to understand. And that's again the nature of the state. So the informal arenas of politics, I think, are not given adequate importance. There was very little talk about the media, and I have my differences with the media, we all know, but the media of late has been assertive, has allowed for some debate on human rights. You've got to consider that it has gone to areas where in the past we would just never have heard the news. So I think the media is playing a role. So my talk really is today, what I wanted to just wrap up very quickly is that this is a very old battle of human rights, but that at the moment today, we are presented with some new opportunities in this current moment of democratic churning. The media is playing a role. For the first time, Pakistan has an overactive judiciary, which also has its downsides, but it is an independent judiciary. The EEC, the Election Commission, is doing something positive. But that doesn't mean that everybody should plunge into the electoral arena of politics, because what that effectively means at this stage, until we clear the situation in a couple of elections, is that it does mean getting tainted. Which is why I think the importance of the informal political arenas have to be recognized, and those arenas have to become the main venues for the articulation of human rights discourse. The presumption that elections and those who are going to get elected are going to be able to present and open up the avenues of human rights is completely false and mistaken, and that would apply for India and Bangladesh as much as it would for Pakistan. So I really would like us to think more about the informal arenas of politics. There's been some talk about social movements by Sadia, which I think is very important, even though I wish Sadia had spent a little bit more time distinguishing the language of human rights from the language of equal rights of citizenship, where the distinction lies. Because without equal rights of citizenship, I'm not sure that we can have human rights adequately ensconced in Pakistan. I also feel that in understanding this question of social movements, what kind of social movements do you need? You need movements that will educate the citizenry. The citizenry has to take on responsibility. The presumption that you cast your vote and your job is done for the next 5 years is one of the great fallacies. And consequently, educating the citizenry to exercise their vote judiciously, their rights, what they can expect of their representatives, not presuming an equation of interest with representatives, but keeping the representatives on their feet, much like what happens in this country, would be the job of this informal arena that I'm talking about. You do need to get people solely and completely active. Here I'd like to mention a party that's come up in India through it's Anna Hazare. They've broken with Anna Hazare, is Kejriwal's party, Aam Aadmi, and their sole focus is not to win elections, but to educate the populace in how to keep their representatives in check and keep them online. And I do think that this is where we need to focus attention, and that is the informal arena of politics. That's where you connect with the media and to some extent even with the judiciary. That will create the momentum. Pakistan, it's not going to be possible for Pakistan to get that pure electoral slate that they're all dreaming of, or the 5-week transformation that Imran Khan is promising if he gets elected. I think this is a very, very long haul. There'll be lots of bad steps, wrong turns. But if the informal arena of politics to which we all belong, if we can cohere, if we can keep our minds together, I don't see any reason why this cannot change. But you have to hold the representatives accountable, and that can be done in a variety of ways. I do want to address one thing that was raised by Anjum Altaf, his notion that he asked this question, what is different about India and Pakistan? Is it the fact that India does not have a divided sovereignty? In fact, it does, because technically India is a federation and all federations have divided sovereignty. But you were referring to the question of God. And frankly, I don't think that the problem in Pakistan is, and the main difference is the fact that Pakistan mentions sovereignty of God over the universe and then also the sovereignty of the people, that is actually the problem. Because frankly, it's far better to have an abstract entity like God having sovereignty over the universe than one sort of Machiavellian ruler, authoritarian ruler, who actually rules in God's name. That has been the problem in Pakistan. The problem in Pakistan has been that military rulers have ruled in the name of God, and not that God has been allowed to rule. So I don't think that is the issue. If you want to know the difference between India and Pakistan, it's very simple. It's the army. India has kept the army under control, and even with its failing, if you like, corrupt democracy in some ways, nobody says that India's democracy is in question. Everybody hails it. India's democracy is not in danger, but Pakistan's is, and I think we have our reasons there. So if we get all that right, I think the one point I also want to make in response to Anjum's point is that what we need to focus on is we need to break out of this elitist orientation of our education system. If we begin focusing in empowering the poor, which you've implied, and I'm not so sure I agree that it is exclusively in the rural areas. I happen to believe that many of Pakistan's burning problems are in the urban areas at the moment. So I would really just say that at this stage we need to break away from trying to bet on the strong and start directing, as Jeffrey Sachs has argued very effectively, to really, if you want to grow, you're going to have to go for the underprivileged. You're going to have to bet on them. This is something President Obama has been saying repeatedly, that we need to give opportunities to the lower and the middle classes so that they can grow. Simply giving tax break to the rich is not going to get us anywhere. I think the same applies in Pakistan as well. So I think the elitist orientation must go. We must begin to talk about the underprivileged because that is good for the economy and not just for the underprivileged. So the final point I want to make is this very interesting panel that we've had, a panel that has reminded us of the many problems that we face, not just in Pakistan, but in this country. But it has been a panel more squarely focused on the question of human rights, and I think because those were asking very large questions, is my view, the earlier panels. So here I would just like to sort of further reiterate that, Madiha has done an excellent job of bringing in those colonial misconceptions or deliberate conceptions of the frontier. We do need to add the fact that the people of the tribal areas themselves, and here I refer to the Maliks and those who are the powers that be, not the innocents, that they have also not wanted any intervention. They want the monies, but they want nothing to change, and that really is a problem. But I do think that quite as much as the American policy, which would be inconceivable without the complicity of Pakistan's military establishment. There has been a deliberate policy to keep Fatah in this situation. It's the plausible deniability issue. All my life I've grown up in this country where one of the great human rights abuses was that people would be killed, murdered in the urban areas, and they would disappear into the tribal areas and they would be given protection. It was a deliberate safe haven maintained by the military because it suited its purpose. So I do think that when we talk about the problem in terms of sorting the issue out, this complicity with the Pakistan Army and America's very strong complicity in keeping democracy retarded in Pakistan because it's preferred to work, until recently at least, with the army. But perhaps that is the moment we really face when America is fed up with the Pakistan Army. And this is the geostrategic moment when maybe Pakistan has a long shot. And I'll stop at that. Thank you very much.
So does anyone have any last questions or discussion points for Professor Jalal? Oh, in that case, thank you so much for coming out. This was our third Pakistan conference. It's your support which is encouraging that we can begin to have these conversations specifically at the University of Michigan. Just like to thank the students who worked on this, Asim Siddiqui, Zain Khan, Sharik Bashir, Musa Razan, and Lina Alam, and support from the Center for South Asian Studies, including Professor Farina Mir and Zulka. Finally, our sponsors, which included the Office of the President, the American Institute of Pakistan Studies, various departments on campus. Thank you so much for coming out.